now like to introduce you as the next stage to Mike Ramos as local secretary for the San Francisco Bay Area. So, Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. Greatly appreciate it. Brethren, thank you so much. It gives me great joy to now be able to host a personal friend of mine, Brother Adam Kendall. Um, his contribution to the book is entitled The Scandals and Secret Rites of Benjamin Hyam, California's Third Grand Master. A little bit about this contribution. The Scandals and Secret Rites of Benjamin Daniel Hyam, California's Third Grand Master, is a biographical adventure of one of California Freemasonry's most unsung and misunderstood pioneers. Through Hyam's forays into Masonic politics, obscure high-degree rites, and a little in alliance with the famous esotericist John Yarker, this essay introduces the power dynamics of the 19th century fraternal experience and sheds light on the complex yet subtle network of people and events that influence the character of a growing nation. A bit about Adam. Adam is a California-based historian and Freemason, a past master of Phoenix Lodge number 144, a full member of Quata Coronati Lodge number 2076, and a proofreader for their annual transactions, AQC. Additionally, he is the editor of the Scottish Rite Research Society's quarterly bulletin, The Plumb Line, and serves as the second vice president of the Philalethes Society. And with that, Adam, I happily hand the floor over to you.
Thank you, Michael, and welcome everybody this morning, this evening, etc. I'm very, very excited to present this paper today. It's been a passion of mine for many years. A little bit of background on this paper is I first, becoming a Mason, I was introduced to the joys of Masonic proceedings and happily dove into them. They are well known to almost all of us, but largely unsung resources. They are primary sources. And our most worshipful John Cooper and I were talking years and years ago about scoundrels in Masonry, and he introduced me to Benjamin Hyam, who was our third Grand Master. And he was the first Grand Master and only Grand Master ever to be put up on Masonic charges. I'm interested in some of the lesser known highways and byways of Freemasonry. And so he immediately intrigued me. And as I began to understand over the years his story and what happened, I realized that there were many interpretations of it, but also many facets to this man's life. He truly is, as with many of those who came from elsewhere into California, they have a multifaceted background, but Hyam really does embody that spirit of the immigrant. Hyam was born in 1813 in London. He was Jewish, and his family emigrated when he was 12 years old to Jamaica, just outside of Kingston. There he grew up and he married into a wealthy plantation owner's family. He studied medicine enough to become a physician and also read law. So many years we don't really understand what happened to him during his adolescence and early adulthood, but he appears in the United States military during the Mexican-American War. And he is in the US military as a clerk in Veracruz during the siege of Veracruz. The Americans would eventually try to march on Mexico City. He becomes a Mason there in Quitman Lodge, which has been chartered. It's a military lodge chartered by the Grand Lodge of Mississippi. This opens up a whole new avenue to Masonic research, especially for us Californians. Lodge was chartered by several different Grand Lodges, and one of them that appears in there is Louisiana. And up until recently, I don't believe it's been very well understood, this contribution. It's contentious, it's very complex, and I can't get all into all of it in my paper, nor today. But essentially, Quitman Lodge, that has made Benjamin Hyam a Master Mason, and eventually, very quickly, he becomes their secretary. It turns in its charter and is rechartered under the ancient York Masons of Louisiana, which is an invading Grand Lodge that was sanctioned by the Grand Lodge of Mississippi to sort of push out the French influence. Again, this is a very contentious and also very complex subject, but for all intents and purposes, he obtains a warrant from the ancient York Masons of Louisiana. And keep in mind, this Grand Lodge is not recognized by anybody except for Mississippi. And he goes into California in 1850. He arrives in January. He arrives with his friend L.A. Besançon, and they quickly hook up with Robert Semple, who is another California pioneer and a founding father of the town of Benicia. Hyam goes over there. They set up by March. They're already building what is now still the first purpose-built Masonic temple in California, and they proceed to form Benicia Lodge. This tale goes on and on because it is so multifaceted. So it incorporates the beginnings of California Freemasonry, with Hyam at the center of it as a founding father. This irregular Grand Lodge that he belongs to is a source of contention. It eventually amalgamates with the Grand Lodge of Louisiana, which forever changes the character of that Grand Lodge, but everything seems fine up until Hyam, who rises through the ranks of the Grand Line, becomes, and he does many good things. He starts the per capita system. He, as deputy Grand Master, he charters the first lodge in, well, at least American lodge in Hawaii. He was very fortunate as deputy Grand Master because the Grand Master was called out of state. So he essentially got a head start on being Grand Master. But when he was Grand Master, he made a few men, Masons at sight, which means to convene a temporary lodge and confer the degrees of Masonry in full form or some sort of truncated form on men who otherwise would have never been perhaps voted in a lodge. Sometimes it's very rarely used, let's just say that. And it's usually conferred on men in the military or men of high social standing or rank. So you have to be very special. Well, one of the men he conferred the degrees on was a very special man, very affluent member of the San Francisco Jewish community, but he had been rejected by California Lodge number 1, which was a powerhouse lodge. And one man, Hyam, went up against this lodge. The contention of his somewhat irregularity, as well as his ambitious desire to fight the members of California 1, did not endear him to the Grand Lodge constituency. He was put up on Masonic charges, but as the Grand Lodge had no way of dealing with this sort of impeachment, they asked him to resign, to which he said no. Hyam is one of those men that embodies this sort of cutthroat optimism of this time, this kind of social Darwinian struggle out west, where if you were not first, you were nothing. The rapidity in which they began building this new society, because they had completely rejected the Californio-Mexican style of governance, they formed their new societies as a mirror of where they had come from. Hyam was an American Mason. He had undoubtedly he undoubtedly knew his vast knowledge of Masonic law from probably Mackey and other writers. He eventually leaves San Francisco and goes overland and finds himself in the Confederate States of America Army, working as a clerk. He has many adventures. I'm just trying to summarize here. He gets involved with a Confederate spy, is thrown in jail, and then eventually he finds himself back east where he's working for the Freedmen's Bureau, which essentially is retaining the rights back to men who had lost their land during the war, be they ex-slave or soldier. He forms an alliance with Harry Seymour, who is the Grand Master or Grand Hierophant of the Rite of Memphis, which is trying to gain a foothold in the United States. And so Hyam's life intersects many different aspects of the American experience, the frontier experience, the opening up of states, which were gained after the the Mexican-American War, which effectively won most of the Western states we have now, the American Civil War, and the proliferation of an American Masonic identity. There were several high degree rites proliferating during this time, and indeed the American craft lodge experience was still evolving. The Rite of Memphis, as many of you may have heard of, is an Egyptian style rite. Hyam does not appear to be very philosophically oriented, and this reflects the character of this rite at this time, which is essentially dare I say, a cool kids club. Men who were already 33rds or past Grand Masters, this was their laurel. They were going beyond the 33rd degree. Hyam rises in rank in this Grand Lodge. If you can forward the slide, please. I'd forgotten all about these things in my excitement. And forward, this is just the splash page. This is Benjamin Hyam, undated photo, courtesy of the Library Museum at the Grand Lodge. And then forward this again, and we'll get to see the evolution of Hyam from Grand Master to official in the Rite of Memphis. Most Masons don't really consider these lesser known rites, and more often in our local areas, we don't consider the subtle connections which extend beyond our own jurisdictional lines. California being an international state, sometimes we still remain a bit parochial. And we know we come from other places, and even to this day, so Hyam is not singularly an exciting person. We have many exciting people, but Hyam is one of those fascinating people that if you were to dig into their lives, you'll see so much that you will, perhaps as I will, produce a book about him. Hyam goes back to his native England as an official of the Rite of Memphis, but as a past Grand Master, he gets to swan about London, presenting himself as a past Grand Master. The Masonic press in England picks up on him and understands that he has a rather controversial character back home. The Rite of Memphis already is very controversial in England. And also, Hyam has a reputation of trading on his name for money. The author of one of the articles presumably had lent him money and found other Masons in New York who he had owed money. Indeed, his controversy with the Confederate spy and his subsequent brief imprisonment was due to an unpaid debt. So Hyam has money troubles, and he also appreciates his reputation. Even back in California, he was very much interested in his reputation. Is he wrong for this? No, he's very much like everybody else during this time, but he has a particular penchant for spreading his name around. He gives the high degrees of the Rite of Memphis to John Yarker, who is a young, at this time, esotericist, and Yarker himself has a very interesting and multi-layered history. Hyam does eventually go back to the United States, but he has been disgraced for his association with Memphis, and also the English press picks up on his scandals of making Masons at sight of men who had been rejected by lodges. Even though Hyam, I do believe, in researching this case, Hyam, although he was rather forceful with his authority, a bit overbearing with his authority, he may have been right, because the man who he made a Mason at sight had been rejected for a name change. The man had changed his name due to fear of prejudice for being Jewish. Hyam was very sensitive to this and had been called upon by several other San Francisco Jews to rectify the situation. There are evidences and tinges of perhaps some anti-Semitism. And this case brings light to the experience of the California Jewish community and the relationship of Freemasonry and its importance to this community. I'm indebted to the work of Dr. Tony Fells for his work on this. As you can see, there are so many chapters to Hyam's life that can branch off into other chapters. You can cleave off one and create a whole new paper out of this. So it was very difficult to put all of it into one paper. But I hope that when you read this, you'll get a sense of the complexity of this man, and also what was the character of Freemasonry at this time. Clearly, he embodies a grand master of power. We don't think of them in this way in the modern age, but Hyam embodies a sort of power to whom, of a sort of a civic religion, to whom governors, presidents will bend their knee. And he certainly acts like this, much to the chagrin of his constituents. Um, I was asked, what did I discover and why did I do this paper? Again, I've described why I've been almost, very interested in these obscure highways and byways of Freemasonry, and I'm deeply interested in California history. Um, but what did I discover about him? Primarily how the power dynamics worked at this time. I'm still trying to put my finger on it, but it's a lot deeper than we may perceive from our readings and our proceedings or any kind of history book. California, especially the narrative of the conquest of American California, is usually told in some kind of the lost days of yore sort of narrative, and a lot of difficult and very important aspects of it are either left out or downplayed. Through this paper, I sought to sort of rediscover the complexity of this time period, and also, present a man who is very powerful, but also very, very, very human. So, with that, if you have any questions, I could rabbit on about this for days, but that's it in a nutshell. Do you have any questions?
All right, Adam, thank you very much for that. Yeah, we do have a few questions that have come in, and I will pose these to you now. Do you believe American Freemasonry could have ever embraced the primitive rite in the same way it ultimately did the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite or Knights Templary, etc.?
I don't believe it could. It already had cut its legs off from the very beginning. It has a very contentious early history. Even the Grand Orient shut it down. Um, by the time it reached the United States, the two main leaders had already broken off their relationship together. Harry Seymour was an ex-Cernoist, so he had that going against him. He'd already been kicked out of the Cerno Rite too, for setting up an irregular Supreme Council. His other friend, Calvin Burt, rejected Harry Seymour's truncating. So let me back up. Harry Seymour followed the Grand Orient suggestion to truncate the rite to 33 degrees, which is clearly a power move on the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, or at least it was perceived as such by Albert Pike, who got involved, even mentioning Hyam by name because he's involved in this whole milieu. Calvin Burt rejects this and moves to Chicago to spread his own. He keeps the original 95 degrees and moves to Chicago to spread the rite on in the Midwest and in the West Coast. This rite does appear in California, even never got off the ground because the man they chose died. But it never really got off the ground because of the efforts of the Supreme Council, Southern Jurisdiction. And even if they hadn't been involved, how they propagated the rite and who was involved would have just stopped it immediately. They were essentially selling their degrees. And I know in our Masonic history, there was a lot of that going on, but there was a sort of disingenuity or attached to it. So the men getting their patents essentially knew even less about Freemasonry and the rite that they were now propagating. So no, I don't really have confidence that it would have gotten off the ground. Again, it became a cool kids club for high degree and powerful Masons. Certainly, Yarker tried to take it to tried to realize it in what he idealized it to become. But again, he never really got it off the ground either. He did, but it never became popular. It eventually becomes very noteworthy in other esoteric side orders as an influence,
Okay.
as a result of Yarker.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Next question. During Hyam's tenure, do you believe California and or American Freemasonry was more genteel than the current makeup of the craft today? Or from its inception, has it always had a fairly gritty blue collar makeup?
Mm, that is a very good question. In the United States, I mean, it's you have to look at where Freemasonry is in any given space, and of course, the United States is composed of 50 states, right? And then there's the rest of North America, and then Central and South America. So you really, and then there's the cities within it. You can't really say that it's this or that. I do know that there are in some sections, you did have maybe not necessarily at certain times in the 19th century, gritty blue collar workers because it was frankly too expensive and a little bit more exclusive. Um, Odd fellowship became very popular for the for those men and other orders, but Freemasonry tended to be of a merchant class. So today, perhaps a middle class, but it just depends on the area. 1850 California is definitely not exactly New York City, right? Although California does evolve into the sixth largest economy in 1850, it's a backwater. The Mexican and before that Spanish control, it was Alta California or Northern California or above the Mexican border, was not well populated. It was sort of a frontier. Most of the people that lived there were ranchers, right? So when the Americans came, there's of course cheap land and there's not a large infrastructure. There is a completely foreign society that they do not understand. And well, also there is the Native American nations that lived there too, which they certainly did not understand. So it's often been said that many of the men that came over, even though that they traded in their business suits for dungarees, um, they many of them had noble intentions, but they were colored by the attitudes of their time. Let's just say that manifest destiny, that what they were bringing was a correct form of civilization, even though we may have issues or problems with that today. But there was a grittiness. There was a tendency, because they were largely away from their families, to accept looser morals than they normally would have in their home states. A great many atrocities were committed. Um, but the idea of Freemasonry at its core, though, was seen as a civilizing factor for the men. Thomas Starr King, who came a little bit later on, was an itinerant preacher and very important Mason in California, very brief though, that saw it as a civilizing force and a way to bring men together in peace. And from his work with the African American community, we see that he intended it to be a unifying factor rather than just for Anglo Americans. So that's a
Okay.
long-winded explanation,
Uh,
but
no, no,
you
it's
know,
it's good. It's good.
we can't put our we can't put our finger on what is gritty, what is blue collar masonry, etc. We would be wrong to do such things.
Well, you're adding more perspective to it, so that's greatly appreciated. I have one last question for you. If Hyam were to witness Freemasonry in America at present, do you believe he would see it as having come into its own in the way he might have imagined or envisioned?
Perhaps with the you know, that's hard to say because perhaps with the more of a religious tolerance, I suppose, but he would have disliked some of it. Although you know, the politics during this time are very difficult, of course, and he leads a charge with the San Francisco Democrats to oust the Know Nothing Party, which were a nativist political secret society. They were anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant. Hyam obviously is an immigrant, and he's Jewish, and so is very sensitive to these things. I think that he would have appreciated the more willingness to accept men of different faiths and backgrounds, but he would have disliked the tendency for nativism. That's not unique in our own age. I mean, we have problems with this the world over in every age, every time. I get into that a bit in some of my other writings. But I can't, you know, this kind of question is difficult because I don't know, and I'm still trying to in all honesty, I'm still trying to dig into the mind of a man that's been dead for years. He died penniless and broke. He had many ailments, but um, it's listed that he had senility as well. He was a man who really kind of tried to relive his glory days in a lot of ways. In one of his last letters, he wrote the lodge that he founded, but yet the men there at that generation didn't know him at all, and he had to recount his origins, asking them for $250. It's sort of sad to see that happen, but many of it was his own fault, but also um, it's a very human experience. So would he like Freemasonry today? I just honestly can't say, unfortunately.
Well, that's fair enough. Adam, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And I know those out there that are ordering the book today or that have it either greatly appreciate your contribution or will certainly find such when they dig into the book. So thank you,
May
my
I
brother.
add? Thank you, and may I add that the sources for this came from proceedings, but also the archives of lodges, and also not just in Grand Lodge archives, but in the lodges themselves. And so I want to advocate that when looking for subjects to speak about or write about your own respective projects, uh, do look at home, look at what's closest to you. You will find the heart of fraternalism and Freemasonry within these archives of these lodges. And sometimes, as I did or I discovered, I found a I'm not being funny when I say this. I found a literal gold mine of information. And so I want to advocate for that. Look to your own home.
Very well, my brother. Thank you very much.